Hey y'all, thank you for taking the time to view my presentation on application of human systems content to House of Cards Season 4, the US version, with Kevin Spacey and Robin Wright. First off, I want to go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Sean Quinones. I'm 23 years old. I got my Bachelor's of Arts in Public Administration from Texas State University, and I'm currently working on a Master's of Science in Interdisciplinary Studies. I'm a registered federal lobbyist and currently a campaign coordinator for the John Tomaides for Mayor campaign here in San Marcos. I'm also the founder of a political consulting group in San Marcos as well as we do some work in Austin. I am currently a graduate research assistant for the Occupational Workforce and Leadership Studies program, and I am a proud Puerto Rican with a beautiful cat at home. I love to travel, I love to do photography in my spare time, and I just love being outdoors. And for anyone interested, as you can see, I am single. So I picked House of Cards for this project mainly because House of Cards is an extremely complex TV show. From season 1 to season 4, there is a lot going on that ends up coming together for a bigger picture. Lots of complex organizations involved as well, which is why I thought that this would be a great TV series to do for this project. So, what's to come? What should you expect from this presentation? Well, first I'll start off with a short summary of Season 4 specifically. I could talk about every season and kind of build it up to where we are now, but I think it'd be most beneficial to focus on Season 4 only. And then what we'll do from there is we'll begin to apply some of the theories that we've learned from this class. So we'll be looking at complex adaptive systems, we'll be looking at self-organization as well as chaos theory as well, and talk about some examples from the show as well. So, first, Season 4, what happens? So we start off Season 4 with our First Lady, Claire Underwood, played by Robin Wright, in her absence. This is after the end of Season 3 concludes with Claire telling President Frank Underwood that she's planning to divorce him. Claire goes back home to Texas, where she's from, to start planning her own political career. She goes to stay with her mother, who she is estranged with, and she begins planning to run for Senate. From there, her and Frank start to butt heads. He doesn't want her to run for Senate, wants her to hold off. She does not want to wait for Frank's permission anymore. They start to butt heads and both begin showing their strength in ways that are actually hurting one another. Throughout this fight, Frank is actually shot by a former reporter who you come to know in the earlier seasons as well. And this season actually begins with you seeing a little bit about this former reporter. He's now imprisoned because of Frank potentially being worried that he could hinder his path to the presidency. So he's a rather emotionally tortured man. He ends up attempting to assassinate Frank and is not quite successful, but does end up killing one of Frank's very close bodyguards, Edward Meacham. After that, Claire steps up while Frank is fighting for his life. He is shot and ends up having to have a liver transplant. And so while Frank is fighting for his life, Claire steps up to assist Donald, the new VP, or the VP who has now stepped into the role as president. She does this well to basically show people that she is an individual who could still go on without a husband. Frank receives a liver transplant, ends up surviving, and begins to recover from there. After this recovery, we see Claire and Frank reach a sort of new partnership. Their partnership has seemed very solid throughout the seasons, but begins to, seem a little rocky in season 3, and so we start season 4 with sort of a breaking point. So after Frank begins to recover, they start to re-examine their political and personal relationship and end up finding out that they both want the same thing and Frank ends up deciding that it is probably best to allow Claire to step into a position that she feels is best for her. So by redefining their partnership and allowing that communication to happen, they're able to reunite and kind of put to bed any ideas of divorce from there. They then begin to set their plan forth, which is basically to have Frank as the presidential nominee for the Democratic Party and Claire as the vice president. This is really weird because it's never been heard of a husband and wife both running for president and vice president. So, by unorthodox means, Claire and Frank are actually able to obtain the Democratic nomination for president and vice president. They do this through a series of different methods, and some of which we'll talk about in a moment. And then they, look at their new challenge, which is beating the Republican nominee, the Conways. So, what systems are at play here? So, I personally feel that the complex adaptive system best explains the interactions um, that happen in House of Cards. So, House of Cards is based off of the government, which has many, many, many working parts. So, just like in House of Cards, there's many different individuals and organizations and agencies that have to work together, that have to essentially find a way to keep um, striving for the goals that each entity has. So even each individual in this show, minor and major, have some sort of intention. They're each individual independent agents acting on their own accord, but essentially creating this sort of environment and this sort of relationship that each one of them has. So, throughout the seasons of House of Cards, you'll see that all these government entities somehow are intertwined and all pushing and pulling on each other. And like I said, even the individuals, major and minor characters, they sort of stand as their own entity in a way. They're all being forced to adapt to this ever changing Washington, D.C. environment. And so it's really interesting if you see throughout season 4 and even from season 1 to season 4 to really look at all these independent agents working together and also working against each other to create um, this sort of environment that creates this sort of complex adaptive system. In addition, there is definitely some self-organization and chaos theory here as well. So, Frank and Claire sort of create their own reality. When things aren't going the way they plan, they don't accept them for what they are. So, Frank and Claire actually start to begin utilizing a self organization to gain power and control in DC. Both of these individuals, as well, are using chaos theory. They both utilize chaos to their advantage. If things aren't going their way, like I said, they may just create chaos um, in order to fool public opinion or to manipulate others into doing whatever it is that they need them to do. So, because of the complex systems of power and politics that exist within DC and within the interactions that are going on, they must really utilize certain behaviors, certain interactions with individuals, and they're very highly thought about. They aren't just random actions or random behaviors. They're highly thought about because even the slightest change, even the slightest interaction, negative or positive, for Frank and Claire, can give rise to just extreme consequences that can determine um, whether their path goes the way they want it to or not. So, there are a couple examples of this as well. In the show, there is a point where Claire and Frank decide that they need an open convention at the Democratic National Convention in order to get Claire in the position to be VP. So instead of going about traditional methods, they decide to have an open convention. A bit chaotic, this typically doesn't happen in the real world, and so Basically, an open convention allows anybody who is an American citizen who basically is able to run for president, run for vice president. Anybody who meets the qualifications can become president. So, you, me, Dr. Bowden McGill, anyone really. In an open convention, we could become a nominee for president, vice president, and so on. So this creates a sort of chaos in the convention, but throughout their manipulations, and they're able to actually get the end goal, which is Frank as the presidential nominee and Claire as the vice president. Also, another example of this is the end scene where um, basically Frank and Claire are dealing with a terrorist group that they've been able to negotiate the release of a few Americans, mothers, children, but their father is still being kept by this terrorist group. And at a certain point, when Frank and Claire feel that they cannot manipulate the situation anymore, when they're worried about a certain article coming out that could potentially harm their chances of winning, they decide to allow this terrorist group to televise the murder of this American citizen, thus creating a sort of chaos, a sort of fear in the majority of Americans, hoping that it will kind of take their attention away from this toxic news story that could actually kind of ruin their chances of winning the election. So these are two examples where Claire and Frank both engage in chaos theory, where they're utilizing the chaos and actually kind of, fostering it a little bit in order to manipulate others and get to a point where they feel they have a sort of power and control over the situation. So, final thoughts. I am a huge fan of House of Cards, mainly because I feel it is a very close depiction of the political landscape that we find ourselves in today. A lot of the theories that we discussed in this class were definitely applicable to the public sector as well as the private sector. A lot of the times we feel disenfranchised by our political system, and so this show really kind of sheds a light on all of that and sort of makes you see how twisted and how dark and how misleading politics can be, and how a lot of the ways in which change happens in Washington is through backdoor dealings and very much under the table. And so this show is well written, well organized, and I definitely look forward to season 5. Thank you for taking the time to listen to my presentation, and I hope you found it as interesting as I did. Thanks, y'all. Have a great day.